Hi, my name is Benjamin Rosewall, and this is my VFL AFL Grand Final attendance maths investigation. This is for EDF 4267, Mathematics Education 3. So first I thought to myself, how many people have attended the VFL AFL Grand Final annually since it was first held in 1898? From here I developed some research questions. How many people have attended each Grand Final? What year had the largest attendance? What year had the lowest attendance? Was the attendance affected by World War I and World War II? How did the venue influence the attendance? And what else has affected attendance over the years? So my aim is to gain an in-depth insight into the history of VFL AFL Grand Final, to further understand the breadth of multiple influences on sporting attendances in Australia, and to further understand the changing environment of VFL AFL Grand Final for fans. So my plan is to source data, analyse the data, format large data sets into tables/graphs using Excel, analyse the tables/graphs and find any unique trends/outliers, research the trends/outliers, and present findings using smaller data sets, which would be easier to see. So my rationale for this investigation, I wanted to choose a topic that interests me. I've been quite fortunate to attend 4 AFL Grand Finals myself and know how difficult it is to obtain a ticket. I'm interested to see what attendance rates have looked like over time, as well as any interesting trends, and I'll see if you can guess which team I go for. So my data/findings. So originally I started at afltables.com, which is a very handy website. It gave me lots of information on each grand final, including year, teams participating, venue, score, and crowd. So from this data, I started creating my own table. Okay, so things that are going to be relevant to my investigation, such as the year, the crowd attendance, and what number grand final that was. Now, understandably, I was not very confident at Excel at the start of this assignment, so I used tutorials throughout our shoots and also tutorials on YouTube to enhance my skills and just create more confidence in using Excel. And quite frankly, after using some of these tutorials, I felt very confident in Excel, and once I had the formulas down, I felt quite easy to even help others use Excel. So my first graphs for crowd attendances for AFL VFL Grand Finals. Now, as you can see here, quite large graphs with some information, but a bit difficult to read. I found that having such a large sample size of over 100 years created some difficulty when looking at specific years. So what I decided to do first was to refine my data. So here I grouped data together in decades. So I looked at adding together, let's say for instance 2007 to 2016. So I add all these attendances together and then divide that by 10, which is the number of years I added together, and then find average attendance for that decade. So with this information, I made refined graphs, which will be average attendance for the grand final in 1898 to 2016. As we can see, 1898 to 1906, our average was just above 20,000 people, and then this started to increase all the way to 1967 to 76, where the attendance average was close to 120,000 people. Then there was the decline the next 3 decades to 1997 to 2006, where the average was below 100,000, more that 90,000 mark, and then on to 2007 to 2016, where the average attendance was close to 100,000 people. If we further look to more refined graphs, we've got a similar graph here, but with the totals. So like we said before, 27,362 people from 1898 to 1906 average, and this increasing all the way up to 67 to 76, where 114,915 people was the average, and then this decreases over the next 3 decades and then rises slightly in the most recent decade, where there's a 99,388 average for the last 10 years of the AFL VFL Grand Final. So as we can see here in our line graph, we're starting just near that 20,000 mark in 1898 to 1906, and then rising all the way up to 67 to 76, then declining over the next 3 years, and then a slight rise at the end, hovering around that 100,000 mark for the last 10 years. Now if we look at my advanced radar graph here, we can see that our first decade, so 1898 to 1906, we've got an average of around 27,000, and this increases to 42,000, the next decade 47, the next decade 59, next decade after that 68, the next decade after that 88, the next decade after that 101, and then peaking at 114, and we've got a slight decrease, 106, the next decade 92, the next decade 91, and then a slight increase the last decade, 99,000 over 2007 to 2016. So next I looked at my original graph again, and I tried to find some key points to investigate. So as we're moving into the next slide, I had 6 key areas of investigation. So number 1, where there was a slight decrease. Number 2, where there is no attendance 1 year. Number 3, whereas there is another decrease. Number 4, where we're looking at more modern times of the AFL, when the competition turned from VFL to AFL competition. We've got a decrease just for 1 year in 4. And number 5, sorry, a decrease for 2 years, and then returning to similar levels. And then number 6, of course, the highest attendance. Okay, so Area 1, World War I, 1914 to 1918. So as we can see here, there's increase from 1909 to 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, rising from 37,000 all the way up to 59,000 over 5 years, and then a steep drop down to 30,000 people in 1914, which happened to be the first year of the war. A slight increase in 1915, and then another decrease of around 18,000 people for 1916. So in 3 years, the AFL attendance dropped close to 40,000 people from 1913 to 1916. And this corresponds directly with World War I. And this is understandable with people going over to fight in war. Even some of the players went over and were conscripted to fight in World War I. So understandably, after the war finished, the attendances rose back up towards that 50,000 mark. So Area 2, 1924. So interestingly, there was no grand final in 1924. Essendon was handed the premiership after an experimental 1924 final system, in which teams competed in a round-robin final series, much like an English Premier League system. So Essendon had also finished on top of the ladder in the regular season, leading to no challenge of their title. So if Essendon had not finished on the top that year in the regular season, and they won the final system competition, they would have the right to be challenged by another team that finished on top in the regular season. But because they finished on top for both the regular season and the final system, they were handed the premiership without a grand final. So Area 3, World War II. So much like we saw with World War I, attendances were increasing up to the start of the war. Then 1939, the first year of the war, there was almost a drop of 20,000 people. And then 2 years after that, 1941, it had risen slightly, and then a steep drop the next year, 1942, to 49,000, and the year after that, 1943, 42,000. So this is in the middle of the war. 1945, the war ended, and as we can see in our table, the attendances rose after those years, getting back to that 85,000 mark. So Area 4, I was interested to see that attendance only dropped for 1 year. So on further investigation, I found out that 1991 the MCG was under renovation, so they held the AFL Grand Final at the time at a different venue, which was Waverley Park. Now this was just for 1 year, as we can see in our table. Our attendances got back up to that 95,000 mark. The attendance was just over 75,000 for that Grand Final 1991, which was peak attendance for Waverley Park. Interestingly, less than 15 years later, the ground had been demolished and replaced with housing estate. Quite a shame, considering I live down near Waverley Park, and I'm also a Hawthorn supporter. So Area 5, 2003 and 2004. So Grand Final attendance for these 2 years dipped significantly, close to 15,000 less people. So first off, I thought this could do with the two teams competing in those Grand Finals, which were Brisbane, Collingwood in 2003, and then Brisbane, Port Adelaide in 2004. But on further investigation, I discovered that the MCG was actually being renovated in those 2 years in preparation for the 2006 Commonwealth Games. So the ground for 2003 and 2004 was actually at maximum capacity for that time, which was just below 80,000 people. So Area 6 would be 1970, where the largest attendance at the AFL Grand Final was the 1970 Grand Final, where attendance peaked at 121,696. The game included teams Carlton and Collingwood, two of the largest clubs at the time. As we can see here, there's a snippet of the paper. A record 121,696 saw Carlton win. As you can see here, a photo below, the crowd is absolutely packed. So extra investigation. So as I was doing this investigation, I was having some trouble lining up my data. I was finding that there was actually more Grand Finals than years. And then it dawned on me that I had forgotten about the AFL VFL Grand Final replays. So there's been 3 draws, 1948, 1977 and 2010. Now in these 3 draws, what happened is the teams were finished on a draw at the end of the game, so then the next week they play another Grand Final. Now it's interesting that for all 3 times that this has happened, the Grand Final attendance was less. So in the first year, 1948, it dropped significantly, more than 20,000 people less than 20,000 people went the second week, and a drop in attendance for both 1977 and 2010 as well. So in conclusion, the VFL AFL Grand Final is a very popular event and has been for over 100 years now. Although attendances have always been relatively high, events such as war and infrastructure improvements have affected attendance significantly. The average attendance peaked around 110,000 in the 60s and 70s due to fans' access to standing room. The attendance will most likely hover around 100,000 people mark unless there's further extension to Melbourne Cricket Ground. So throughout this investigation, I was thinking implications as a teacher. So for students, it connected to my interests. It was a very open-ended task, which you could take in any direction that you sort of felt necessary. There was mathematical concepts throughout the task, and allowed me to immerse myself in the data. Now, interestingly, there was a willingness and enthusiasm to share findings with not only other peers completing the task, but anyone that I found interested in AFL, I would want to tell them this information and stats. And there was engagement throughout the task. I had a lot of fun, which is kind of funny to say in this task because I didn't see it as a university assignment. I felt like I was just doing this out of investigating the topic and wanting to find out more about the AFL. So I found it quite enjoyable, and I could see how students would find this enjoyable in class. Thank you for listening to my presentation.